The cell measured 4 meters by 4 meters, which Kael had determined by walking it 17 times in each direction, while the alien in the corner watched him with what he hoped was curiosity and not hunger assessment. The walls were neither Terran nor Doran in manufacture. They were old, older than both civilizations by geological estimates, according to the Compact's briefing file that Kael had memorized out of boredom during his 3-week detention in the transit bay before being dumped here. The prison was called Station Kareth. It orbited no planet. It existed at a gravitational null point between contested space and unclaimed space, which made it technically belonging to no jurisdiction, which made it the perfect place to put people neither side wanted to acknowledge having imprisoned. Kael called it the drawer. As in, the place where you put things you don't want to throw away but can't bear to look at. Kael. So, you refused an order too, huh? The alien, a Doran, obviously, even Kael could recognize the silhouette of the enemy, turned its head. Its crest shifted from a deep amber to something closer to violet. Kael had no idea what that meant. He knew the color language existed in theory. Every soldier received a 30-minute briefing on Doran biology that was 80% focused on how to kill them and 20% focused on the fact that they communicated partly through chromatophores in their head crest. The briefing did not include a color dictionary. Kael. Right. I'll take that as a yes. Or a threat. Or a weather forecast. I genuinely cannot tell. The Doran made a sound. It was low, clicking, with a rise at the end that Kael's brain insisted on reading as a question mark. He had been in this cell for 6 hours. The alien had been here by the scratches on the wall, and there were scratches, which meant it kept track of time, which Kael filed under terrifying and reassuring simultaneously, for what appeared to be 11 days. Kael. My name is Kael. Kael Morrow. Sergeant, formally, though I suspect the rank is more formally than I'd like. He sat down against the opposite wall, back against the cold composite. I'm guessing you're not going to eat me, since you've had 6 hours and haven't started. The Doran clicked again. 3 clicks, a pause, 1 longer tone. Its crest went green at the edges. Kael. Is that your name? Something like that. Click, click. Long tone. Click. The crest flared distinctly, almost emphatic. Kael. Voss. Voss something. The crest went brilliantly, suddenly white. The Doran pulled back slightly, and then, and Kael would later say this was the moment everything changed, it nodded. A slow, deliberate dip of the head that it had clearly adapted from watching humans, or from some biological accident of parallel evolution, or from something Kael didn't understand yet. It had learned a human gesture. It had chosen to use it. Kael. Voss. Okay. I'm going to call you Voss because I know you have a longer name and I know I am going to completely mangle it, and I would rather start from honest incompetence than pretend I can do something I cannot. He paused. My mother always said that was my best quality. My honest incompetence. The alien called Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then, with what Kael would eventually learn was the Doran equivalent of a reluctant exhale, it clicked a short sequence, 2 notes, rising, and pointed 1 elongated finger at Kael. 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 Yeah. That's me. Voss clicked the 2 notes again. Not quite right. The vowel was off, the human AE impossible for a throat built for harmonics, but close enough that Kael's chest did something embarrassing. Day 1. 2 words between them. It was, by any measure, a terrible start. It was also, by any measure, a beginning. By day 8, they had established 23 words. Not Doran words, not human words, their own words, a pigeon of gesture and click and badly pronounced approximations that lived only between them, in this 4x4 room, in a prison no one officially acknowledged. Kael had scratched their vocabulary into the wall with a piece of broken composite tile he'd found near the ventilation grate. Voss had watched him do this and then added notation beneath each word in what Kael assumed was Doran script, angular, crystalline characters that looked like frozen music. Food. Water. Cold. Hot. Yes. No. Question. Wait. Look. Listen. Sleep. Hurt. Anger. Confused. Name. Day. Wall. Door. Outside. Together. Alone. Human. Doran. 23 words. They used them constantly, with the desperation of people who had far too much to say and almost nothing to say it with. The meals arrived through a slot in the door, twice a day, and were nutritionally calibrated for each of them. Kael got something approximating ration bars and processed protein, while Voss received a pale blue gel that smelled faintly of copper and seemed to sustain it adequately, judging by the fact that it had not withered. One morning, Kael's tray slid in and landed upside down, spilling reconstituted protein paste across the floor in a way that was both tragic and somehow geometric. Kael. Perfect. That's fine. He stared at it. Voss stared at it. Then Voss did something that rearranged Kael's entire model of what the alien was. It made a sound. A rapid, cascading series of clicks with a descending tonal pattern, its crest cycling through amber and green in a flickering pattern, and Kael realized, with a slow warmth that surprised him, that this was laughter. Alien laughter. Laughter directed at his ruined breakfast. Kael. Oh, you think that's funny? You think this is comedy? Voss's crest went full amber. It was still clicking. Kael. Yeah, okay. It's a little funny. He laughed too. It came out rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in months, which was essentially accurate. Voss watched his face while he laughed. Watched it with that focused attention it gave to every new human behavior, cataloging, filing, translating into categories it could understand. Later, when they had more words, Kael would ask Voss what it thought human laughter looked like to a Doran. Voss would take a long time to compose an answer, and then click and gesture something that Kael would translate, haltingly, as, "Like your face is breaking and you don't mind." Kael decided that was the most accurate description of laughter he had ever heard. On day 12, they had their first real argument. Kael had been attempting to explain, using their vocabulary of 29 words and a great deal of mime, why he had refused the order that landed him here. He'd been ordered to fire on a settlement in the Kethra cluster that military intelligence had designated a weapons manufacturing hub. Kael had walked the settlement parameters on his tactical display and found 12 heat signatures consistent with children under 10 years of age, and he had said, clearly, calmly, and at career-ending volume, no. Voss listened to all of this, absorbed the gestures, the facial expressions, the halting combinations of their shared words, and then made a sound Kael was learning to recognize as a negative judgment. Disapproval, but specifically the kind of disapproval that wasn't directed at Kael personally but at the situation that made the story possible. Kael. You get it, right? I couldn't do it. Voss clicked. Then it gestured at its own crest, then at the wall, then made a motion Kael had learned meant, before, or the past. Kael. Why are you here? You want to. He tapped the wall, their word for, tell me. Tell me. Why Voss here? Voss was quiet for a while. Its crest went a deep, slow blue, not the pale blue of its food, something richer, the color of water that goes all the way down. Kael had not seen that color before. He waited. What followed took 40 minutes to communicate and required the invention of 6 new words. What Voss had done, its unit had taken a human prisoner, wounded, near death, unarmed and incapacitated. The unit commander had given the order to execute the prisoner, as per standard protocol during contested zone operations. Voss had interposed itself between its commander and the human. Had refused the order. Had received the execution order redirected at itself, and survived only because 2 other unit members hesitated long enough for senior command to intervene and choose imprisonment over the political complexity of executing a decorated warrior without full tribunal proceedings. The human prisoner had died anyway. Of wounds, 2 days later, in a Doran medical facility that treated alien biology the way Kael treated Doran script, with genuine effort and terrible results. Kael. He died anyway. Voss's crest went briefly white, yes, and then back to blue. Kael. But you still did it. You got between him and the gun even knowing you might not save him. Voss clicked something. Just one word, one of their 29, together. Kael pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a while. The argument he'd been building, that their situations were morally equivalent, both deserving of the same kind of bleak solidarity, collapsed. Voss's situation was worse. Voss had failed to save the person it sacrificed itself for, and was imprisoned anyway, and was in here with an enemy soldier, and its crest was the color of deep water. Kael. I'm sorry. About the guy. The prisoner. Voss looked at him. Made a gesture Kael had come to understand as acknowledgement, not forgiveness or absolution, just, I hear this, I receive it. It occurred to Kael that he had just apologized to a Doran for the death of a human, and the Doran had accepted the apology, and none of this fit inside any framework the Terran Compact had given him for understanding the enemy. He wondered how many frameworks he was going to have to break before he understood what was actually happening here. By day 21, their shared language had grown to 94 words, and they were starting to construct sentences with the greedy efficiency of people who had been starving for conversation. Voss, it turned out, was funny. Not in a way that translated easily. Doran humor was apparently built on a foundation of cosmic scale and structural irony that required a 30-second setup for a one-click punchline, but funny nonetheless. Kael was the first human to ever understand a Doran joke, and he took an amount of pride in this that was completely disproportionate to his circumstances. More usefully, Voss had a mind like a crystalline lattice. It saw patterns with the same ease that Kael saw faces, instinctively, automatically, without effort. It was Voss who first noticed something wrong with the scratches. The cell had previous occupants. That much was obvious. The scratches were layered, days counted in different styles, different depths, some in what appeared to be Doran script and some in human numerals and some in a third notation that neither of them recognized. Kael had assumed the third script was something alien he simply hadn't encountered. The galaxy was large, the war had displaced many species, there were intelligent civilizations he'd never been briefed on because they weren't strategically relevant. He had not, until Voss pointed it out on day 21, noticed that the third script appeared in both the human sections and the Doran sections of the wall. Kael, wait. Say that again. Slower. Voss clicked, and then pointed, at the left wall, where an older set of scratches had been partially covered by newer ones, and within those old scratches, the third notation appeared. Then it pointed at the far wall, near the ventilation grate, where Doran script layered over itself in what were clearly different time periods, and within those layers, the same third notation. Kael. Someone wrote the same language in both the human section and the Doran section. Someone who knew both. Or someone who wasn't either. Voss's crest went sharp white. Yes, Kael. This cell has held humans and Doran before us. White again. Kael. And something else. Something that wrote in both walls. Voss clicked a word they'd invented 3 days ago during a conversation about the food slot. A word for the thing that controls this place. Then it pointed at the ceiling, at the walls, at the door, encompassing the station itself. Kael. The station masters. Right. Whoever runs this place. They looked at the third notation together, for a long time. It was Voss who found the panel. Doran sensory anatomy was different from human anatomy in several ways, one of which was a thermoreceptive sensitivity that allowed them to detect minute temperature variations in surfaces, a hunting adaptation from their evolutionary history on Dorak Prime, where prey animals were cold-blooded and hid in thermal camouflage. Voss had been running its fingers along the walls in idle moments for days before it stopped suddenly, on day 23, and clicked for Kael to come look. The panel was behind a false section of composite wall. Not hidden with any sophisticated technology, just a slightly different thermal signature, the material inside fractionally warmer than the surrounding wall. Concealed well enough that no human inspection would find it, and apparently well enough that no Doran had found it either, because the panel appeared to have been undisturbed for a very long time. They got it open in 4 hours, using the broken tile and a food utensil that Voss had quietly pocketed 3 weeks ago with what Kael was now retrospectively identifying as premeditation. You kept the fork for 3 weeks without telling me. Voss's crest went briefly amber, which Kael now knew meant something like, yes, and I regret only that it took this long to be useful. You are absolutely ruthless and I respect it enormously. Inside the panel was a data core. Small, old, built in neither Terran nor Doran architecture. The casing was a material Kael had seen once in a military briefing about archaeological sites in the Kefir Belt, pre-contact material, from a civilization that had been extinct for at least 3,000 years. A civilization whose existence was barely acknowledged in current academic literature and almost entirely absent from military intelligence briefings. A civilization called, in the few texts that mentioned them, the Anhet. Station Kareth was not built by the Terran Compact. It was not built by the Doran Collective. It was built by people who were dead before either species had developed spaceflight, and it had been in continuous operation ever since. The data core took 2 days to open. Voss's thermoreceptive fingers could feel the lock mechanism, temperature-activated, Anhet technology, designed for hands that ran warmer than human or Doran, and by the morning of day 25, applying sustained contact heat from a heated food container, the casing clicked open. Inside, a crystalline storage medium. And, miraculously, built into the panel alongside it, an interface they could partially operate. Not designed for human or Doran use, but designed for minds, for intelligence generically, and it recognized the contact and it opened. The data was in Anhet script, which neither of them could read. But data cores are not only text. The Anhet were visual communicators who understood that the most important information should transcend language. What came through, slowly, fragmentarily, in images and diagrams and something that functioned like a timeline, was clear enough. The Terran-Doran War had been running for 19 years. It had killed, by the last casualty estimates Kael had seen before his court-martial, approximately 4 million humans and an unknown but comparable number of Doran. It had been sparked by an incident in the Kethera cluster, a Doran attack on a Terran science vessel without provocation, which the Compact had used as the legal and moral basis for a declaration of war. The Doran Collective maintained that the attack was a response to Terran aggression in the Outer Belt, and the Compact maintained that the Outer Belt incident was itself a response to Doran encroachment, and the argument had been going on for 19 years with 4 million dead as its evidence base. What the data core showed was a third party. It showed, in images, in diagrams, in the unmistakable visual language of surveillance footage, a species that was not extinct. A species that had allowed itself to be declared extinct, that had retreated into the spaces between the stars where neither Terrans nor Doran had reason to look, and had been operating from those spaces for 3,000 years. The Anhet. Alive. Few, perhaps only thousands remaining, but alive, and watching, and working. The core showed the Kethera incident from an angle no Terran or Doran had ever seen. A third vessel, of Anhet manufacture, broadcasting on frequencies that would register to both sides as the other side. A trigger, manufactured and deployed. A first shot that came from neither combatant. It showed earlier incidents, going back 40, 50, 100 years. Moments that had soured relations between the two species, that had prevented treaties, that had collapsed negotiations. Each one examined, each one with the same third vessel signature hidden in the telemetry. It showed why. Kael. Resources. Voss clicked. Yes, but more. Kael. Not just resources. What's the word? Territory. Space. They want. He stopped. Looked at the diagram again. The Anhet retreat, 3,000 years ago, had not been a defeat. It had been a strategic withdrawal. A civilization facing two emergent species, both of whom would eventually outgrow their systems and expand into space that the Anhet had once occupied. A civilization that chose, rather than conflict, to manufacture conflict between the two threats. To let them destroy each other, or weaken each other sufficiently, over generations, until the Anhet could reclaim the space they'd vacated. Kael. They're waiting us out. They've been waiting us out for 3,000 years. The war, our war, it's not our war. It was never our war. We're fighting each other because they made us afraid of each other. We're killing each other so they don't have to. Voss had gone very still. Its crest was cycling through colors Kael had never seen before, a rapid, complex sequence that he didn't have words for, that went beyond the vocabulary they'd built, that was purely Doran in a way that reminded him she was, fundamentally, something he could not entirely know. Then Voss made a sound Kael had heard once, and only once, in a very different context. On the 29th day of their shared vocabulary, Voss had done something strange. It had pressed one hand flat against the wall, the vocabulary wall, covered in their 94 words, and made this sound. Kael had catalogued it without understanding it. He understood it now. It was grief. Kael. 4 million people. Your people and my people, Voss. 4 million people, and we were the distraction. We were the distraction while they waited for us to thin each other out enough to. He couldn't finish. He sat down on the floor, and the data core sat between them, and outside the station the stars were as indifferent as they had always been. There was a long silence. The longest silence they had shared, which was significant, because they had shared many silences and had become fluent in the distinctions between them. The silence of sleep. The silence of thought. The silence of two people who come from different biologies and are doing the work of bridging them. This silence was different from all of those. This was the silence that comes when something has broken that you did not know was holding you up. It was Voss who broke it. It clicked 2 words. Just 2. Their words, from the vocabulary wall. Together. Outside. Kael. We have to get this out. We have to get out and get this to somebody. Both sides. At the same time, so neither side can bury it before the other sees it. Voss clicked 3 notes that Kael had learned to read as, and then what? Kael. I don't know. But 4 million people, Voss. If the war stopped tomorrow, even if both sides spent the next 50 years hating each other, that's 4 million fewer dead people. Voss looked at him. Its crest settled, for the first time in hours, to a single color, white. The color Kael now associated with clarity. With yes. With certainty. With, I trust this. Getting out was, theoretically, impossible. The panel was inside the cell. The cell door was locked. The station guards, infrequent, presumably automated, did the cell check every 48 hours, which they knew because Voss had been counting for 11 days before Kael arrived. Inside the panel, beyond the data core, there were controls. Station Kareth was Anhet built. Its systems were Anhet systems. The panel was, among other things, an interface for those systems, built by the station's original architects for their own use, and never repurposed by the subsequent operators, whoever they were. Kael and Voss had a new set of questions about the station's management now that they understood its age, because no one had known it was there. Voss could operate it. Not read it, but operate it, thermoreceptively, feeling the system logic through temperature response the way a blind person reads Braille. It took 3 days. 3 days of Voss working the panel for hours at a time while Kael tracked the guard intervals and talked quietly, partly to stay awake and partly because the silence when he wasn't talking had started to feel like a premonition. On the 3rd day, they identified a communications relay. Anhet built, still functional, connected to frequencies that, by the best assessment Kael could make from the frequency charts displayed, predated both Terran and Doran communication standards and sat in spectrum ranges neither side actively monitored. Kael. If we broadcast from that, they won't pick it up. Voss clicked something that meant, not with their standard equipment. Kael. But every vessel has receivers they don't use. Emergency spectrum receivers, archaeological survey equipment. If we can make the signal loud enough that it triggers passive alerts. Voss was ahead of him. Its fingers were moving on the panel. The temperature signatures were changing. Kael. How much power does that relay have? Voss held up both hands, all 8 fingers, then folded them down to 4. 4 units. Whatever those units were in Anhet notation, Kael read the sequence correctly. It was not enough to reach anything useful at standard output. To reach anything, any Terran or Doran vessel within 3 light hours, they would need to output at maximum. Maximum, Voss communicated through a combination of gesture and temperature language, would drain the station's power core. Everything on Kareth would go dark. Life support included. Kael. How long would we have? Voss considered, then held up 3 fingers. Kael. 3 hours. White crest. Yes. Kael. Is there a vessel docked to this station? There has to be. Someone brings our food. Voss worked the panel. After 20 minutes it clicked, affirmative, and then made the gesture Kael associated with small. A supply drone. Automated. Docked to the outer ring. Minimum life support. Designed for cargo, not passengers. Kael. Can 2 people fit? Voss tilted its head. Then held up 1 finger. Kael looked at the finger. Then at Voss. Then at the panel. He ran the numbers without wanting to, because they were simple and obvious and had been simple and obvious since Voss first showed him the relay output, and he had been hoping the drone solution would make them less so. Kael. 1 person can fit in the drone. White crest. Yes. Kael. And 1 person stays. White crest. Yes. And then Voss's crest went to that deep blue again, the all the way down blue, and it pointed at Kael. Kael. No. Voss. Click. Voss clicked the word for listen. Then it pointed at the data core. Then it clicked a sequence of words from their vocabulary, deliberately, choosing each one, you. Outside. Together. Both. Words. You go outside. Together means both our words. The meaning, You speak for both of us. Human words, Doran testimony, same message. You go and tell our story because if a human tells it, the humans will listen first, and the first ear is everything. Kael. The Doran Collective won't listen to me. Voss clicked something that Kael only half understood, and then with clear frustration at the limits of 94 words, it did something it had never done. It took the tile they'd used to open the panel, and in the space on the wall below their vocabulary, it wrote, in Doran script, quickly, with the confidence of someone who'd been composing this in their head for longer than they'd admitted, a full message. A paragraph. Maybe more. Kael. I can't read that. Voss pointed at the data core. Then at the message. Then made the gesture for same. Copy it. Broadcast it alongside the core. Every Doran receiver within 3 light hours would receive a message in their own language, from a Doran warrior whose name they would know, decorated, imprisoned, honorable, saying, I was there. I found this. It is true. Kael. Voss. I'm not leaving you here. The life support goes. Voss clicked the word for cold. Then the word for Doran. Then, and this took Kael a moment, because it was a word he'd invented but Voss had quietly adopted, the word that meant tolerant of. Doran metabolism. Of course. Cold tolerant. Not cold immune, but Doran biology ran slower than human biology in low temperatures, and could sustain consciousness at temperatures that would incapacitate or kill a human being. If the life support failed and the station cooled, Kael had hours at best. Voss had, potentially, much longer. Kael. A rescue team. If the broadcast works, if someone responds. White crest. That's the plan. That's always been the plan. Kael. And if no one comes in time? Voss held his gaze. Its crest did something extraordinary. It went through every color Kael had ever seen on it, in a slow cycle, like a review, like a summary, like everything they'd said to each other in the language of light. And then it settled on white. White, which meant yes. Which meant clarity. Which meant certainty. Which meant, I know. Kael sat with it for 2 hours. He sat with it and didn't talk, which was its own kind of eloquence. Voss sat across the cell and was quiet too, its crest a steady, unflickering white, and Kael looked at it and thought about all the things he didn't have words for. He thought about the prisoner Voss had stood in front of. Who had died anyway. About the children in the Kethera settlement he'd refused to fire on. About 4 million dead and the species that had manufactured every excuse for each of them. He thought about what his mother had said about honest incompetence. He thought about the 30-minute military briefing that was 80% about how to kill a Doran and the fact that there were 94 words on the wall that the briefing had not prepared him for. He thought about the word Voss had chosen when it wanted to explain why it had stood in front of a dying human prisoner. Together. Kael. Okay. Voss's crest went briefly amber. The laughter color. The fallen breakfast color. Kael. Don't look so smug. I haven't said yes yet. Amber, sustained. Kael. I'm going to be very annoying about this. I'm going to make sure every rescue team in known space knows your name, and I'm going to be extremely irritating about the timeline, and if you die in here I'm going to be furious with you for the rest of my life, which may not be very long, but I intend to spend every minute of it being angry. Amber. Then, slowly, white. Kael. Yeah, okay. Let's end a war. They spent 14 hours preparing the broadcast. Voss copied the data core into the relay system through the panel interface, working with a precision that Kael watched with something close to awe. He did what he could, helping with the physical work, testing the drone's manual controls, accessible from the panel, and had architecture apparently including remote dock access for reasons of their own, checking the life support depletion rates against Voss's metabolic estimates. When it was ready, they stood on opposite sides of the cell and looked at each other for a long time. Kael had gotten better at reading Voss's crest. Not fluent. He would never be fluent. That would take years and a proper learning structure and resources he didn't have, but good enough. Good enough to know what the color Voss's crest settled on, in the last moment before Kael pressed the initiation sequence, actually meant. It was a color between blue and green. The color of the teal in deep ocean where light still reaches, barely, just enough. A color Voss had used only once before, on the day Kael had laughed for the first time in the cell, rusty and real, and Voss had been watching his face break and not mind. Kael didn't have a word for it in their vocabulary. He decided the word was probably something like, "I'm glad this happened." Even this. He pressed the sequence. The broadcast went out at maximum power, across Anhet band frequencies, carrying the full data core and Voss's message and a voice recording Kael made in the 14 hours of preparation. Not scripted, not polished, just him talking directly into the relay's acoustic receiver in the way he'd been talking to Voss for 31 days. Clear. Honest. Without a framework provided by anyone who hadn't been in this cell. The lights went out 40 seconds later. The station systems descended, one by one, into darkness and silence. Kael found the drone in the dark, by feel, by the slight thermal difference at the dock junction that he'd learned to perceive from watching Voss. He sealed himself inside. The drone's independent power was minimal but sufficient. Basic propulsion, basic life support, a beacon, and one communications channel he'd programmed to repeat the broadcast continuously on Terran frequencies. He launched at a velocity that carried him away from the station at 3 kilometers per second. Through the drone's small forward lens, he watched Station Kareth recede. Ancient, dark, still, built by a civilization that had pretended to die and spent 3 millennia killing in the shadows. He could not see the cell from here. He watched the station until it was a point of light indistinguishable from the stars. The first response came in 11 hours, from a Terran survey vessel that had been running passive archaeological spectrum scans in the outer belt. Exactly the kind of vessel Kael had hoped for, crewed by scientists and not soldiers, people whose first instinct was curiosity rather than threat assessment. The second response came in 14 hours, from a Doran communications relay station that received Voss's message and recognized the name. Voss Cathalan was, Kael learned this in fragments, over the following days, not just decorated. Voss was from a lineage that held political weight in the collective, a family name that carried obligations of credence. A message bearing that name, from a known prisoner, with data of this scope, could not be quietly suppressed without a fight. The data core went to 37 different receiving stations in 8 days, through 11 different parties, carried by humans and Doran who had each independently decided it could not be hidden. It was not a leak. It was a flood. It became impossible to contain before anyone with the authority to try to contain it had fully processed what they were trying to contain. Kael was extracted by the survey vessel and spent 48 hours giving testimony to parties he had not known to summon but who summoned themselves. A compact admiral. A Doran diplomat whose crest did things that Kael could not yet read, but who listened with the quality of attention that transcended language barriers. An academic who specialized in pre-contact civilizations and wept audibly upon viewing the Anhet data core. He spent every moment that was not testimony demanding information about the rescue operation. The rescue team reached Station Kareth 19 hours after Kael was extracted. 31 hours after the life support had failed. The station's temperature had dropped to -40 degrees, which was survivable for a Doran in metabolic slow state, but survivable only in the most technical sense of the word. They found Voss against the vocabulary wall. Its crest was dim, barely lit, a faint and barely there teal, and its metabolism had slowed to approximately 6% of normal function. It had, the medical team told Kael later, perhaps 4 hours remaining. It took 11 days for Voss to be stable enough to receive visitors. Kael was the first visitor. The medical facility was neutral space, built in the 14 months of the war suspension, because the war had suspended, not ended, not yet, but suspended, frozen in the amber of an ongoing investigation that both sides were now too exposed to abandon. Kael walked in and found Voss in a room with good light, its crest recovering its range of color slowly, like a sun coming back after an eclipse. He sat down. Neither of them spoke for a while. Kael, you look terrible. Voss's crest went, unmistakably, amber. Kael, I learned 17 new words in Doran while you were unconscious. I want you to know I pronounced all of them wrong, but I tried. The medical team was very patient. Amber, sustained. And then, slowly, still weak, but clearly there, the clicking sound. Cascading, descending. Laughter. Kael, I'm told the war talks start in 30 days. Both sides. Same table. I'm told neither side wants to be there and both sides have been told they don't have a choice, which is apparently a diplomatic first. He leaned forward. They're calling it the Kareth Accord. After the station. He paused. After us, I think. Whether or not they're saying that. Voss's crest went white. Then it clicked something, a long sequence, more complex than their shared vocabulary, real Doran, real language that Kael didn't fully have yet. He held up a hand. Kael. Slower. I only have 111 words. You're going to have to work with me here. Voss made the amber laughter sound again. Then it clicked, slowly and deliberately, in their vocabulary, together. Words. More. Kael. Yeah. Kael's voice was steady, which was harder than it looked. Together. More words. We have a lot of catching up to do. There are, at the last count, 214 words on the wall of Cell 7, Station Kareth, now maintained as a historical site under joint Terran-Doran administration. Historians debate their meaning. The two people who made them are still working on the translation. The Anhet were found 18 months later. Not through military action, not through the investigation triggered by the Data Corps, though that investigation ran concurrently and produced its own catastrophic revelations, but through archaeology. A xenoarchaeologist following the coordinates embedded in the Anhet Data Core, with a Terran-Doran joint research grant that had never existed before and would later be cited as the first product of the Kareth Accord, discovered a habitation signature in a region of unclaimed space that had been unremarkable for every purpose except this one. The Anhet numbered 11,000. They were old, their lifespans extended by biotechnology into centuries, which explained both their patience and their miscalculation, because immortal things sometimes forget that the people they are waiting out are not static, that mortals who have enough time and enough reason can become something entirely different than what they were when the waiting began. They had expected two exhausted, depleted civilizations. They had not expected a joint investigation team. The Anhet's legal status, the question of what you do with a species that has spent 3,000 years engineering the deaths of 4 million people as a geopolitical strategy, occupied legal scholars on both sides for a generation. The outcome was complicated and insufficient and better than nothing, which is how outcomes usually go. But the revelation that mattered most, that changed the meaning of every battle, every loss, every grave on every world, was not the Anhet themselves. It was the implication of their plan. The Anhet had needed the war to continue. They had needed it to be productive, to genuinely weaken both civilizations, to reduce populations, to exhaust resources. A war that ended too quickly, through negotiated peace, would have been useless to them. So they had manufactured provocations only when peace looked likely. They had intervened, over 19 years, at each moment when the war might have stopped. Every ceasefire that had collapsed. Every treaty that had failed in committee. Every diplomatic mission that had been ambushed, every peace delegate who had died in transit, every moment that had seemed like bad faith but might have been manufactured bad faith, every one of those moments was now evidence. Every one was an Anhet intervention. Every one was a moment when peace had been close enough that someone needed to destroy it. What this meant was, every time two humans had looked at each other across a line and chosen not to fire. Every time a Doran warrior had hesitated. Every time a soldier had refused an order, had said, clearly and at career-ending volume, no, they had been fighting a different war than they knew. They had been fighting the Anhet's war. And they had been losing it. And they had also, in the only way that ultimately mattered, been the only ones fighting back. The soldiers who refused. The warriors who hesitated. The people who said, not this way, I will not do this. They had not known they were resisting a manufactured war. They had not known there was a hidden enemy. They had only known what was in front of them, the specific, particular human or Doran face, the specific, particular order that could not be followed, and they had made the specific, particular choice to say no. It had not stopped the war. It had not, in any individual instance, saved anything. The prisoner Voss stood in front of had died anyway. The settlement Kael refused to fire on had been hit by another unit 6 days later. But it had produced this, two people in a cell, who built a language out of 94 words and used it to end what 4 million deaths had not. Two people who were put there because they refused to be what their civilizations needed them to be, and who became, in that refusal, exactly what the future needed instead. The Kareth Accord was signed on a Tuesday, which seemed insufficient to the magnitude, but time does not adjust its calendar for history. Kael Morrow and Voss signed it together, as joint witnesses, the only two signatories who were neither diplomats nor generals, who had been invited not for their rank or their status, but because the document required, the signatories had agreed, at least two people who already knew what peace looked like from the inside. Who had built it once, with nothing, in a 4x4 room at the gravitational null point between two wars. The pen Kael used ran out halfway through his signature. He made a frustrated sound. Voss, crest full amber, cascading, descending, was still laughing about it when the flash photography started. The photograph that ran on the front page of every Terran newscast showed a human man with an empty pen and an expression of resigned exasperation, next to a Doran warrior whose head crest was cycling through every color it knew, in a pattern that the accompanying article, written by a xenolinguist who had spent 14 months studying the vocabulary wall, translated as, "Like your face is breaking and you don't mind." It was, by any measure, a beginning.